Hello and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be ranking all of System of a Down's studio albums and try to ignore how late I'm recording this. As I said before in other videos, my sleep schedule is really messed up. I'm trying to fix it and I'll try to go to bed soon. But yeah, as I said, I am recording this very, very late. But I will try to go in depth in this video and explain why I'm ranking this album higher than the other one and so forth, because I will say a lot of tier list videos and ranking videos are pretty arbitrary and don't really give a good explanation for why somebody thinks this album or this song is better than this one or this one. It's just very, very general. They don't really go, and a lot of people don't really go into specific details, and I'll try my damnedest to go into specific details, even though I do forget a lot of song names, and you will realize that as the video goes on. But yeah, as I said, I'll try to explain myself as best as I can, and also please try not to get mad at me for these rankings. I really don't think that most people are going to get mad at me for these rankings, because I'm just going to spoil it. All System of a Down albums are really, really good. I don't think they have a bad album ever. They all are really, really good. Especially in terms of just new metal, they are fucking on top. They have insane quality to all their albums. So let's get into their first album, their self-titled, and probably their darkest sounding, no, not probably, their darkest sounding album by far. Or not by far, because Hypnotize has some certainly dark sounding tracks and somewhat of Mesmerize and maybe Toxicity doesn't have that many dark sounding tracks. But yeah, as I said, this is definitely their darkest sounding album. It has a lot of creepy sounds to it, especially with Peephole at the beginning with that circus, really creepy circus beginning with the chopped vocals from later in the song. I find that really cool. I love that intro. But also just the other songs, even the singles for that matter, are also kind of creepy. Except for maybe Sugar. I mean, Sugar's just a fun time, I will say. But especially Spiders with that really haunting chord progression. And that's what I love about a lot of the songs on this record. The chord progressions, they're really melodic even on their first album, and I really, really like that, while still having very heavy and dark riffs to this album just in general. I will say that a lot of this album, or not a lot, I mean just some of the songs can kind of blend together, because a lot of it does have that kind of just general dark metal tone to it. And that's not necessarily a terrible thing. I mean, all the songs on this album are really good. That's why I'm putting it in A tier. But as I said, just again, some of it just is a little bit hard to differentiate from another song. But yeah, as I said, this album is great. I love all the singles from it, even though there aren't that many. And I also really like the closer, and I think the closer is the only one where you actually get Darren's just vocals that he uses on a lot of other future of a System of a Down albums. On a lot of future System of a Down albums is what I'm trying to say. I completely botched the grammar there, but well, not the grammar, but just the structuring there. But yeah, you get what I mean. Just in general, this album is great, has a lot of dark sounds to it, which I love, and is their darkest album even still, which I like. And now we go on to Toxicity. I mean, this is a classic. I shouldn't need to say where this goes. This goes in S tier. Honestly, when I first listened to it, I wasn't the biggest fan of it. I like Prison Song and I guess Dear Dance, and I still love those tracks, and I'd still say those are some of my favorites on the album. But I've grown to appreciate a lot of the singles and the deep cuts, especially Psycho. I love Psycho. I love that fucking song. Especially the guitar solo at the end with the more reverb heavy outro with the strings. I love the strings on this album. I feel like that's what this album was missing, and why their first album was missing, and why a lot of it sounded very similar. Besides maybe, again, people with that circus kind of atmosphere to it, and the very light use of synths on very, very a very, very minute amount of tracks. But yeah, as I said, just again, I feel like this album is where they really expanded their sound into something more palatable and less dark sounding, but yet at the same time a lot more politically driven, and just generally just with tighter songwriting and song structure, with more of the songs sounding a lot different from, or a lot of the songs, I mean, I'm trying to speak correctly here, I'm sorry. Just, again, a lot of the songs just sounding different from one another. They don't all sound the same, or a lot of them sound the same. Like that can kind of plague the first album a little bit. But yeah, as I said, this album is a classic. Basically, everybody knows this album by now, and it is very, very good. Phenomenal new metal album, even if they're not, they're kind of new metal. They're kind of not. I would classify them more as just standard alt rock and metal, but they are technically new metal, and I think they're amazing for being a new metal group, especially. Like, they are very, very good. A lot of new metal groups I have found are just not very, very good, especially Limp Bizkit. I don't even want to talk about them. I've already made a video on them like a while back, but yeah, I really just am not a big fan of Limp Bizkit. I'm sorry, but I just can't really I can't really take their music seriously at all. Meanwhile, System of a Down is the exact opposite. Like, yes, they have a lot of very goofy, corny tracks, but they actually realize it. They're not trying to like make it sound like, it's like, oh, this is super serious even when it's not. No, they're making it sound goofy when it's supposed to sound goofy and when the lyrics are goofy. Like, they're self-aware, and that's what I like about a lot of their albums as well. But next we go on to Steal This Album, which I honestly think is their weakest album. I think most people can agree with me on that. Some people will say Hypnotize is their weakest album, although I'll get into that later. And I did also make a video like kind of reviewing these two albums anyway, but I do really like Steal This Album still. In fact, I'm going to put it there. It's a very good album even still. I love the single Boom, really catchy, and it's still very politically driven as well. Still carries a lot of that energy from Toxicity, which I really enjoy. What I do feel on this album is kind of that same feeling that I kind of got on their first album, though, which is that some of their songs on this album can kind of sound pretty much the same or very, very similar to one another. They can kind of differentiate themselves, and most of the time they do have a chord progression, like one or two, that can, help me differentiate this one song from another song on the album. But again, even still, I feel like this album is kind of similar sounding on some of the tracks, although at the same time, this album is probably their most melodic in terms of overall sound. A lot of the stuff on this album they don't really come back to later, which I feel like is sort of a shame, because a lot of the tracks on this album, especially the really strong tracks, I really love. A big example being the closer Streamline. I love that fucking track. I love the orchestral elements, and they were not shy at all to like incorporating orchestral elements into a lot of their songs on Toxicity, but especially on Streamline, I think they really nailed it with the more like really dramatic production. It's very similar to Ariel's, but I really think it's a lot more heavy and a lot more energizing in terms of the overall like just structure and just how the song is really. But yeah, as I said, I love Streamline. I love the singles on this album as well. I love IEA IAO. That song is also very catchy and great. Just again, this album is very, very solid. But again, it can kind of feel kind of samey at some points, which is why I'm putting it down in A tier. But next, we go onto my favorite System of a Down album, and probably a lot of other people's favorite System of a Down album. Now, I will say that, Toxicity is probably their best. Like, if I'm trying to rank them, like, objectively, Toxicity is probably their best. But my personal favorite is honestly Mesmerize. And I know some people will disagree with me, especially because Darren has a lot more vocal contributions on this album, and he did have a lot on Steal This Album as well, which I appreciated, especially on the more like calm moments on that album, which again, they didn't really go back to on even Mesmerize or Hypnotize, but I really do love Mesmerize. I feel like they strike a really good balance at like contemporary songwriting and structure with their more experimental side, and I really do think it's like a marriage of those two sides, and they kind of just put them together into this phenomenal, very tightly packed album. It's just a very short, or not very short, it's still like a standard album length, but it feels short, and that's how good it is. It just flies by like immediately. It's that good. It just is amazing from front to back. I love BYOB. That's easily one of their best singles. Just with amazing verses from Serge and Darren all together. But I also really love the song after that, Revenja. or Ravenga, however you want to pronounce it. I love the more dramatic, like black metal influence on that track, especially on that kind of like solo kind of in the middle of the track where it kind of just breaks down into this bridge and then a big solo with amazing harmonies. I think another big strong suit of this album and why I do think it's my personal favorite is they've nailed their harmonies on this record. Now, they were no stranger to incorporating harmonies on both of these albums as well, and even at some moments on their self-titled. But here on Mesmerize, I feel like they really upped their game in terms of just amazing harmonies. They really go just fucking sicko mode. I don't know how else to say it. They just go insane on this album in terms of harmonies, and it just sounds so goddamn nice. I love their harmonies. In fact, I would say they're probably one of my favorite they're some of my favorite vocalizations, or not some of my favorite vocalizations. I mean, some of my favorite harmonies on any record ever. Like, I think they're probably one of the strongest vocal duos ever. Like, just ever in terms of like rock, even like just rock bands in general. Just they're phenomenal, and I think they can't be replaced at all in terms of their vocals. And again, their harmonies are phenomenal, especially on this record. But also, I really love even the deep cuts on this record. Sad Statue is really, really good. I love the dramatic tone to this record as well. I love Question and how dramatic that song is. Just in general, the songwriting is also great and just amazing. I've already made a review, as I said, of this album, and I know I keep like really messing up my my English, and I'm sorry about that. As I said, my commentary has gotten worse over time for some reason, but yeah, as I said, just in general, I know I said I wanted to be specific, but just in general, this album is amazing, phenomenal. Please give every single one of these albums a listen, because they all deserve your attention if you haven't listened to them already, because all of them are great. But next, I want to get into their last album they've ever released, at least so far, and probably their most divisive. I mean, most people can say that, this is on their top, and most people say this is on their top as well in terms of their list, but a lot of people don't really know where to put Hypnotize. And I'm going to put it in A tier. It's very close to getting an S tier, honestly. I think one thing that does hold this album back, especially somewhat on Mesmerize as well, is definitely the compression and how sometimes it can kind of clip. I'm not sure if this is due to Rick Rubin and how he produced the album, although I don't really think, honestly, it's due to him, because he produced Toxicity as well, and that album sounds stellar. There's no clipping issues whatsoever at all. So I think it just comes down to, I don't know, just the mixers or the people that mastered or mixed this album just wanting to go into the loudness war and basically just clip this album and make it as compressed and as loud as possible, I think. And I think that can kind of hurt the album at some points. Not that much, like it's a very minute amount. But I think on like Soldier Side, for example, on the solo especially, like sometimes it can kind of clip and distort a little bit. It's not that bad. It's not like the worst ever. It's not like it's like fucking destroying your eardrums, but it still is like kind of a wall of sound at points. But yeah, as I said, I do think the compression is probably the weakest part of this record, honestly, because I still feel like this album is great and very consistent, honestly. And while I would say that, the songwriting isn't as good as Mesmerize, and generally I feel like the songs in general on Mesmerize are better, I feel like Hypnotize is still definitely worthy of being a double album, and is definitely worthy of being the last System of a Down album, especially with Soldier Side, which is probably my favorite System of a Down closer just in general. I love that song to death, even with the compression issues, as I've already stated. It's just a phenomenal, very dramatic, very heavy, and really dark song that is probably their darkest in terms of overall themes, or at least one of their darkest in terms of like lyrical contents, at least. But I also really like the push and pull of a lot of the songs on this album as well, how it switches between goofy and, really dark at the same time. And as I said before, I feel like this is probably their darkest sounding album, besides, of course, their first album, which I feel like I was kind of missing from even like Toxicity and Mesmerize. Although Mesmerize did sound kind of dark at points with the chord progressions, but I feel like Hypnotize does sound just generally a little darker and a little more menacing on some of the chord progressions and just overall tones on this record. But yeah, as I said, this album is great. Just generally a phenomenal album. And I know I said in the beginning of the video I wanted to be specific, but again, I already reviewed these two albums anyways, man. And I mean, everybody understands why this album is up here as well. Again, I love Psycho. I love the singles on this album. I love Prison Song. I love Dear Dance. I love every song on this record basically is great. A lot of it is just unbridled in terms of energy and just really, really great songwriting with a lot of political messaging behind it, which I like a lot. And I really do agree with their political message as well on all of their albums. It is really, really cool how they incorporate politics into their album while making it not too overbearing, while making some of the best harmonies on any metal record ever. Even though I haven't listened to that many metal records, I will admit that there's still phenomenal harmonies. And as I said, Serge and Darren are probably some of the best in terms of just overall songwriting and just overall vocal duos ever. Just in general, even in the rock space, just in every genre. I feel like they are easily like some of the best in terms of harmonies. And I feel like they can honestly sometimes kind of stack up to Lennon and McCartney. I know that's a kind of a really hot take to a lot of people, especially like huge Beatles fans such as myself, but I feel like they can kind of stack up to them at points. Their harmonies are just that good, man. But yeah, that is basically it. I've made this video long enough, and I've really messed up my English for as long as I see. I just did it there again, but yeah, as I said, I made this video long enough, and I've really botched my speaking, just in general. So I want to end the video here, and yeah, that is basically going to be it. And I will see you guys later. Goodbye.